March 6, 1944. 23,000 feet over central Germany. 12 Messerschmitt Bf 109s closed from 6 o'clock, less than 900 yards and falling fast. In the tail position of a B-17 Flying Fortress, Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan tracked their formation through a frost-rimmed sight. 24 years old. 2 tours completed. No confirmed kills. Standard doctrine said, hold fire. Conserve ammunition. Wait for convergence. The rest of the crew expected him to follow it. Instead, Donovan rotated the turret 5 degrees left and opened the feed covers. This was not how defensive gunners survived. Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan served as tail gunner aboard a B-17G assigned to the 385th Bomb Group, 8th Air Force, operating out of RAF Great Ashfield in early 1944. His position was the last line of defense in the formation, a single electrically powered turret mounted at the extreme rear of the aircraft. 2.50 caliber Browning machine guns. Limited traverse. No armor beneath the waist. ATAT, 23,000 feet. The temperature in the compartment dropped below minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Tail gunners were not selected for command potential. They were assigned for endurance. It was a solitary post. Long hours facing the direction most crews preferred not to watch. The rest of the aircraft moved forward. The tail remained behind. Donovan had joined the Army Air Forces in 1942. Not from a flying background, not from a military family. He had worked before the war as a machinist's apprentice in Cleveland, Ohio. Precision metal work, gear tolerances measured in thousandths. He arrived at gunnery school already familiar with feed mechanisms, timing, and heat distortion in steel assemblies. Instructors noted his scores in mechanical theory were unusually high for an enlisted trainee. That observation was recorded. It was not emphasized. At flexible gunnery training in Las Vegas, he qualified within the top third of his class. Respectable, not exceptional. His shooting improved over time rather than spiking early. He did not celebrate high-scoring passes. He requested additional maintenance manuals instead. That detail was mentioned once in a training log. Crew assignments were made in late 1943. Donovan was attached to a B-17 crew commanded by a first lieutenant with prior Atlantic ferry experience. The aircraft commander preferred aggressive formation discipline and strict ammunition conservation. The doctrine was clear. Defensive fire only when fighters entered effective range. Conserve for sustained engagement. Maintain overlapping fields of fire with adjacent bombers. No independent initiative unless ordered. Donovan followed procedure without comment. Inside the waist compartment, gunners traded stories about confirmed kills and near collisions. The radio operator kept a running count of engagements per mission. Nose gunners tended to receive early contact. Ball turret gunners were credited with precision work during frontal passes. Tail gunners were expected to absorb the final attack. There was mild humor about the position. Last to see it, first to feel it. The phrase circulated more than once. Donovan did not object. During pre-mission briefings, he asked fewer questions than most. He sketched formation spacing instead. He noted closing speeds. He timed how long it took instructors to describe standard Luftwaffe attack vectors. Head-on passes were fastest. High-side slashing runs followed. Tail pursuits were considered the least efficient for German fighters, but often the most persistent once bombers were damaged. In gunnery drills, Donovan adjusted lead estimates slightly ahead of instruction. He compensated for slipstream drift earlier than advised. When corrected, he acknowledged and recalibrated. Later, instructors quietly confirmed his original calculations had not been incorrect. They had been advanced. That observation did not circulate among peers. Within the crew, Donovan's demeanor was interpreted as caution. He conserved ammunition rigorously during practice. He cleared stoppages without assistance. He recalibrated the K-3 gun sight between flights without drawing attention. No formal commendations followed. The absence of complaints was considered sufficient. By early 1944, the 8th Air Force had intensified deep penetration raids into Germany. Fighter resistance grew more organized. Reports indicated coordinated group attacks designed to overwhelm individual aircraft before a crossfire could stabilize. Intelligence summaries warned of disciplined Bf-109 units willing to press within 300 yards. The crew read the same briefings. On February missions preceding March 6th, Donovan recorded 3 instances of German fighters breaking pursuit after short bursts from long range. No kills confirmed, no damage claims submitted. His after-action notes were concise. Enemy broke formation at approximately 700 yards. Ammunition expenditure, moderate. No overheating observed. The line about overheating was not standard language. It reflected something else. During maintenance downtime, Donovan inspected his own feed trays. He replaced a slightly worn spring that technically met tolerance. He modified the tension adjustment by a fractional turn beyond standard setting. No one objected. Few noticed. In the mess hall, one waist gunner referred to him as the accountant. The nickname implied caution bordering on reluctance. It carried no hostility. It carried no respect either. Donovan did not respond. He logged flight hours carefully. He studied closing rates of Bf-109, variants reported by intelligence. He memorized the approximate time required for a pursuing fighter to transition from 1,000 yards to 300 at full throttle differential. He practiced tracking targets at the outer edge of effective range during training films. He kept these calculations private. No one assigned him authority. No one assigned him an expectation. In early March, weather reports indicated clear visibility over central Germany. Clear skies favored interceptors. Bomber formations would be exposed earlier. Tail coverage would matter more. The aircraft commander reiterated the standing order during final briefing. Hold fire until they commit. We conserve, we coordinate. Donovan nodded once. He did not argue doctrine. He did not propose alternatives. He checked his turret rotation, tested his interphone, and confirmed oxygen flow. He understood something the others did not yet need to understand. Tail pursuit, if disciplined, could become predictable. Predictable movements created measurable intervals. Measurable intervals created windows. No one in the crew anticipated deviation from defensive procedure. No one expected initiative from the rear position. But on March 6th, with 12 Bf-109s forming behind the formation at 23,000 feet, an opportunity would present itself. And taking it would carry consequences measured in seconds. By early March 1944, the 8th Air Force was losing aircraft at a rate that no briefing could soften. Long-range escort coverage remained inconsistent deep over Germany. Bomber formations crossed into defended airspace, knowing they would face coordinated fighter interception before reaching target and again on withdrawal. The Luftwaffe had adapted. They no longer attacked in scattered pairs. They assembled in disciplined packets, striking single aircraft with speed and intent. Casualty summaries were read without commentary. Aircraft missing. Crews unaccounted for. Survivors describing concentrated rear assaults that stripped control surfaces before crossfire could respond. The pattern was becoming measurable. German Bf-109 units increasingly formed beyond effective defensive range, between 1,000 and 1,200 yards, holding position long enough to study bomber spacing. They identified slight drift in formation, a single aircraft marginally low or aft. Then they committed, not in isolated dives, but in layered approach, one element to draw fire, a second to press from blind angle, a third to close once gunners reloaded. Standard procedure relied on restraint. Defensive fire was meant to create deterrence. Early firing was discouraged because it revealed position and depleted ammunition before the main strike. The assumption was simple: conserve until they enter lethal range. But the Luftwaffe had learned the margin. Several after-action reports described identical sequences. Gunners held fire at 900 yards. Fighters advanced without deviation. At 600 yards, warning bursts were delivered. At 400, concentrated fire. At 300, damage was already done. The enemy had calculated convergence windows more precisely than expected. Command briefings began including new language. Expect feint passes. Do not break discipline. Coordinate overlapping fields. The words did not slow the interceptors. Tail gunners bore disproportionate exposure. Head-on attacks were fast but brief. Tail. Pursuits could be sustained. German pilots discovered that if they remained just beyond initial defensive range, gunners hesitated. That hesitation compressed reaction time when the final dive began. Aircraft returning to base displayed recurring damage patterns. Rudder assemblies compromised, horizontal stabilizers shredded, control cables severed. In some cases, tail sections failed entirely under stress. The problem was not lack of firepower. A B-17 carried sufficient defensive armament to discourage any single fighter. The problem was timing. Conventional solutions focused on tighter formation spacing. That improved crossfire but reduced maneuver flexibility. Escort coordination improved gradually but remained incomplete on deep penetration missions. Gunnery instructors reinforced ammunition discipline. They emphasized patience. Patience, however, assumed the enemy would make the first miscalculation. Instead, German pilots were choosing their moment. Reports from February: missions described coordinated rear elements approaching in staggered altitude, one slightly high, one slightly low, forcing tail gunners to adjust elevation rapidly while lateral elements closed in. The intent was not merely to damage, it was to overload. Defensive doctrine required confirmation before sustained fire. Visual identification, range estimation, clearance to avoid friendly crossfire. These safeguards protected formation integrity, but introduced delay. Delay was becoming fatal. In one mission 2 weeks prior, a neighboring aircraft in Donovan's squadron absorbed a prolonged rear attack lasting nearly 90 seconds. The tail gunner fired only after fighters crossed the 500-yard threshold. By then, the rudder had already taken multiple hits. The aircraft struggled to maintain alignment. A second wave followed immediately. The bomber dropped out of formation within minutes. The crew did not return. These outcomes circulated quietly, not in speeches, in maintenance, hangars, in the way pilots examined tail assemblies before each sortie. Command pressure increased without visible change in instruction. Briefings became shorter, more direct. Stay disciplined. Trust procedure. Do not waste ammunition. There was no formal revision to engagement range. The underlying assumption remained. Defensive posture preserved endurance. But German fighter groups were not engaging for endurance. They were engaging for precision disruption. They waited just long enough to ensure bombers would commit to doctrine. Then they exploited the narrow window between hesitation and response. It created a paradox: fire too early, and ammunition diminished before the true strike. Fire too late, and structural damage prevented sustained defense. Gunners were being asked to identify a moving threshold in seconds. Most chose caution. Donovan studied the same reports. He noted the consistent staging distance. He observed that German formations often aligned briefly at approximately 800 to 900 yards while organizing attack vectors. During that interval, their spacing tightened. Their silhouettes overlapped. They appeared disciplined and confident. That moment had not yet been treated as engagement range. It was treated as observation range. Conventional thinking assumed that fighters at 800 yards remained outside effective lethality. But Donovan understood that convergence was not static. Sustained bursts from dual .50 caliber guns could reach further than commonly used. Accuracy at that distance required anticipation, not reaction. The margin between observation and commitment was shrinking, and every mission reinforced the pattern. If bombers waited, fighters accelerated. If fighters accelerated, structural damage preceded defensive stabilization. If structural damage occurred first, no volume of fire could restore control authority. This was the problem no one had formally addressed. It was not firepower, it was initiative. And Germany on March 6th, with 12 Bf-109s forming deliberately beyond conventional range, the window would appear again. Only this time, someone in the tail position would decide it was already too late to wait. March 6th, 1944. The formation crossed the Dutch coastline just after 1100 hours. Weather over the North Sea had been uneven. Low cloud layers, intermittent glare. But inland skies cleared rapidly. By the time the bomb group approached central Germany, visibility extended for miles in every direction. No cloud cover to break silhouette, no contrails from friendly escort within immediate range. At 23,000 feet, outside air temperature registered near -40 degrees. Frost accumulated along the inner plexiglass of the tail enclosure. Donovan wiped a narrow arc clear with a gloved hand and held it open with steady breath against the oxygen mask. Below, fields were segmented in geometric patterns. Snow traces remained in shaded areas. Rivers reflected sharp light. The formation held position, tight, disciplined, stable. Radar reports had indicated possible intercept activity. Confirmation came moments later. 12 Bf-109s emerged from the rear quadrant at approximately 1,100 yards, slightly high and descending. Their spacing was deliberate, 2 forward elements staggered vertically. The remainder trailing in shallow echelon. Donovan tracked their approach through the K-3 site without announcing it over interphone. The crew had already seen them. The pilot maintained heading. Waist gunners confirmed visual contact but held fire. At 1,000 yards, the fighters reduced closure rate. They did not dive immediately. They adjusted formation, minor lateral shifts, subtle altitude corrections. They were aligning. Standard procedure remained unchanged. Hold until 600 yards. Donovan checked his ammunition counters, both belts feeding smoothly. He confirmed turret traverse resistance. He noted the relative alignment of the 2 lead fighters, one slightly high right, one low left. Their wings overlapped from his angle. For a brief interval, their profiles narrowed. At 900 yards, he made a decision. Without announcement, he applied steady pressure to both triggers. The .50 caliber Brownings responded with synchronized recoil, short bursts, controlled, not continuous spray. Tracer lines extended farther than most gunners preferred to attempt. The range was long. The fighters had not yet committed to a dive. Inside the aircraft, the sudden vibration was unexpected. Waist gunners glanced aft. The pilot did not issue correction. Donovan adjusted lead incrementally. He compensated for slipstream drift and minor tail oscillation. The first German element hesitated. At approximately 850 yards, the high right Bf-109 banked slightly to port. The low left maintained course half a second longer. Donovan narrowed his burst, shortened duration, recalculated. At roughly 800 yards, a visible change occurred. The low left fighter emitted a faint vapor, trail from the engine cowling. Not flame, not explosion. Just irregular exhaust pattern inconsistent with prior alignment. It rolled right, then broke formation entirely. The second lead fighter aborted simultaneously, banking away with increased throttle. The remaining 10 aircraft adjusted course. No radio confirmation of damage came from Donovan. He did not claim a hit. He ceased fire immediately after the break. Ammunition expenditure remained moderate. He tracked the retreating silhouette until it exited effective range. The interphone remained mostly silent. One waist gunner transmitted briefly, "They're pulling." The pilot acknowledged without comment. The remaining German aircraft did not advance directly. They widened spacing, increased altitude separation. Closure paused. For nearly 20 seconds, the rear sector remained clear. It was not a victory, no confirmed kill, no debris observed falling, but the timing had shifted. Instead of fighters dictating the opening dive, a tail gunner had disrupted alignment before commitment. The enemy had been forced to reassess from outside standard engagement range. The formation maintained cohesion. No immediate damage recorded. Donovan recalibrated his sight slightly. He allowed the turret to cool momentarily. He checked feed tension again by feel. No malfunction. The German fighters regrouped at a greater lateral spread than before. Their next alignment was less compact, more cautious. The pilot transmitted to formation. Rear element dispersed. Maintain course. No commendation followed. No reprimand either. Donovan resumed observation. He understood that the disruption had not ended the threat. It had merely altered its shape. The Luftwaffe would not withdraw entirely over open terrain. They would adapt. But the first exchange had produced measurable effect. He had engaged outside expected parameters. He had forced adjustment. And he had preserved ammunition. In the silence that followed, the temperature inside the tail compartment seemed to drop further. Frost reformed along the glass. Donovan wiped another narrow arc clear and tracked the widening German silhouettes. They were no longer forming at 900 yards. They were moving differently now, and that meant the next pass would not resemble the first. The second formation did not resemble the first. The remaining 11 Bf-109s regrouped at greater altitude separation, widening lateral spacing beyond Donovan's earlier firing lane. They climbed slightly above the bomber's tail cone before beginning a staggered descent. The intent was visible: avoid overlapping profiles. Deny a single convergence window. They had measured the first disruption. This time, 2 fighters remained high, 2 low, and the others fanned outward in loose arc formation. Instead of aligning directly behind the bomber, they angled inward from offset positions, forcing Donovan to divide attention across wider traverse. At 1,100 yards, they held distance again, but they did not tighten formation. They were no longer presenting a unified target. Donovan tracked the highest element first. He resisted the impulse to fire immediately. The earlier burst had succeeded because of compression. That condition no longer existed. He adjusted turret elevation incrementally and monitored closure rate. At 950 yards, the high right fighter dipped abruptly, feinting a dive before leveling off. The maneuver forced Donovan to shift aim rapidly downward, momentarily exposing the low left sector unobserved. The enemy was probing reaction time. Waist gunners reported increased lateral movement. The pilot maintained heading, but reduced minor oscillation to stabilize the tail platform. The aircraft's slight vibrations became more noticeable through the turret housing. At 850 yards, 2 fighters committed simultaneously from opposite offsets, 1 high starboard, 1 low port, while a third advanced directly along center line but remained just outside effective fire range. The geometry had changed. If Donovan focused center line, the flanking elements would compress inward. If he engaged a flank, the center fighter could close unchallenged. The margin was narrowing. He selected the high starboard element first. Short burst, immediate correction left. Another short burst. He did not attempt sustained tracking. Instead, he interrupted alignment. The high element banked sharply and climbed out of approach. The low port fighter continued descent. Donovan rotated hard left, compensating for turret inertia. He fired 2 controlled bursts at extended range. The fighter did not break immediately. It pressed forward, reducing distance to approximately 700 yards before banking away. The centerline element had advanced during the exchange. It now occupied the primary pursuit lane at roughly 650 yards, closer than any fighter during the first engagement. Donovan adjusted aim and fired. Tracer arcs intersected slightly below target, before correction. The Bf-109 rolled defensively but did not withdraw completely. Instead, it climbed steeply, crossing above the tail at angle, forcing Donovan to elevate turret near maximum limit. The maneuver reduced his effective tracking window. The Luftwaffe pilots had recognized his willingness to fire early. They were now testing vertical blind zones and traverse limits. The next approach was faster. 3 fighters descended in quick sequence from staggered altitude. No prolonged staging. No pause at 900 yards. They entered firing envelope with minimal warning. Donovan chose not to fire at first sight. He waited until 2 aircraft crossed partially into each other's wake. Then he delivered a concentrated burst at the lead aircraft's predicted intercept point rather than its present position. The lead fighter snapped right and descended sharply, trailing faint smoke. It did not return immediately. The second fighter continued past 600 yards before disengaging under sustained fire from a waist gunner. The third aircraft remained briefly, probing distance at approximately 500 yards before accelerating away. The exchange lasted less than 15 seconds. Ammunition counters reflected increased expenditure. Not excessive, but rising. The German formation reassembled farther out than before, nearly 1,300 yards aft. Their spacing widened again. No direct rush. Instead, they began alternating altitude in rhythmic pattern, high-low-high, never presenting more than one consistent axis at a time. This was no longer simple harassment. They were calculating his response rhythm. Inside the aircraft, tension remained unspoken. No one criticized early firing now, but no one endorsed it either. The pilot's voice over interphone remained level. Maintain discipline. Donovan's discipline had changed meaning. Earlier discipline meant waiting. Now it meant choosing precisely when not to wait. The Luftwaffe introduced another adjustment. One fighter climbed high enough to pass above defensive convergence entirely, then dove at steep angle across tail arc, firing briefly before crossing below. The attack was less about destruction than forcing reactive traverse. Turret motors strained during rapid adjustment. The compartment vibrated under recoil and mechanical resistance. Frost on plexiglass thickened along outer edges, narrowing clarity. Each maneuver required quicker judgment. Donovan no longer had the advantage of surprise. The fighters anticipated early bursts. They avoided overlapping silhouettes. They exploited blind arcs and elevation extremes. The first disruption had forced them to adapt. Now, adaptation was mutual. Distance intervals shortened. Reaction time compressed. Ammunition belts fed steadily, but no longer seemed abundant. The problem was no longer marksmanship. It was selection. Every trigger pull eliminated one option and created another vulnerability. Fire too broadly, and coverage thinned. Fire too narrowly, and flanks advanced. The fighters began circling wider before next engagement, stretching tension deliberately. The delay itself carried pressure. They were not retreating. They were resetting for something coordinated, and when they returned, it would not be in staggered probes. It would be simultaneous. The third regroup did not hold at distance. Instead of forming directly behind the bomber, the Bf-109s drifted slightly right of the rear axis, maintaining loose altitude separation. One fighter detached lower than the others, reducing throttle marginally. Its movement was slower, almost tentative. It presented itself first. At approximately 1,000 yards, the low element advanced alone, climbing gradually toward centerline. No flanking support visible within immediate frame. The maneuver appeared premature, poorly spaced. Donovan recognized the pattern immediately. Bait. He did not fire. The low fighter closed to 850 yards. Still no shot. It continued forward with mild oscillation, encouraging a trigger response. The spacing between it and the higher elements widened deliberately. They were waiting for him to commit. At 800 yards, Donovan maintained tracking but withheld fire. He let the fighter believe the earlier aggression had cooled. The pilot inside the Bf-109 held approach longer than before. At 700 yards, the low fighter began a shallow dive toward effective range. Still alone, then the sky shifted. Two high elements broke simultaneously from above, diving sharply at offset angles. Three additional fighters accelerated from lateral positions that had remained outside Donovan's primary field of view. The formation compressed in seconds. Had he fired at 900 yards, his ammunition stream would have been fixed along the low fighter's path, leaving upper arcs exposed. Had he tracked the bait too long, the converging elements would have crossed within 400 yards unopposed. He waited until the geometry tightened. At approximately 650 yards, the low bait fighter crossed directly beneath one of the diving elements. For a fraction of a second, their silhouettes overlapped. Donovan fired. The burst was sustained, longer than any previous, not erratic. Controlled sweep across both intersecting profiles. The first fighter rolled violently left. The second snapped upward but crossed through the tracer arc before clearing. Smoke trailed from both. The remaining three closing fighters accelerated inward. One committed directly along center line at 500 yards. Donovan shifted without hesitation. Short burst at predicted intercept. Immediate correction left for second target. Ammunition counters ticked downward faster now. The centerline fighter continued forward despite incoming fire. It closed to approximately 450 yards, closer than any prior approach. Tracers from its nose guns streaked past the tail assembly, narrowly missing the stabilizer edge. Donovan corrected elevation by degrees, not feet. He shortened his burst to conserve rhythm, then extended again when the fighter hesitated mid-dive. The Bf-109 rolled inverted and descended sharply, trailing dense smoke. It did not climb back into position. Another fighter entered at high left offset. Donovan traversed hard and fired before it stabilized its dive. The early engagement disrupted its aim. It broke prematurely. The remaining fighters withdrew slightly but did not fully disengage. They circled at approximately 900 yards, maintaining visual contact. In less than 40 seconds, 4 aircraft had been forced out of immediate attack position. 2 emitted visible smoke trails. 1 descended steeply without recovery. There was no time to confirm impact. The Luftwaffe altered tempo again. Instead of single bait, 2 fighters advanced simultaneously from low offset, while 3 approached from staggered high angle. They were attempting overload through timing compression. No gaps between waves. The margin for error vanished. If Donovan misjudged lead by inches, the fighters would cross into the 300-yard zone before correction. If he hesitated, the next element would exploit blind arc. He abandoned prolonged tracking entirely. He fired in calculated interruptions. Burst, shift, never holding position long enough for fighters to calibrate his rhythm. At 600 yards, one of the low elements maintained straight line despite fire. Donovan extended burst half-second longer than intended. Tracer density increased. The fighter's canopy area flickered briefly. The aircraft rolled uncontrollably to starboard and fell out of formation. The high element hesitated at that moment. Slight delay. Donovan redirected fire instantly, catching it mid-transition. The fighter climbed sharply but left a dark exhaust streak. Ammunition counters dropped below half capacity. Inside the aircraft, interphone remained sparse. The pilot's voice steady, tail holding. Another wave began before smoke trails cleared. This time, 4 fighters, compressed within narrow arc at 750 yards. Closer than initial staging distances earlier in the mission. They no longer feared early fire. They were attempting to saturate it. Donovan waited until they crossed into 650 yards. He selected the inner two aircraft rather than outer flanks, anticipating compression point. Sustained burst, measured, not reckless. The overlapping silhouettes multiplied tracer probability. One fighter disintegrated visibly. Wing separation near root. Debris scattered downward. The adjacent aircraft banked late and passed through remaining tracer arc. Smoke ignited briefly before extinguishing. The outer flanking elements broke without completing dive. The duel had shifted. What began as defensive deterrence had become offensive disruption. The Bf-109S no longer approached in disciplined symmetry. They approached under pressure, adjusting mid-flight to avoid convergence they had not expected. Within approximately 4 minutes of initial engagement, at least, 6 fighters had been forced from combat alignment. 2 descended without visible recovery. 1 broke apart structurally. The remaining aircraft circled wider, less coordinated than before. Donovan reduced firing cadence. He allowed turret barrels to cool fractionally. Ammunition levels were now critical, but not exhausted. The hunter had been forced into caution. But the engagement was not complete. The Luftwaffe pilots had one remaining advantage: numbers. And they were about to use it all at once. By the time the remaining Bf-109s regrouped, their formation no longer resembled coordinated packets. It resembled calculation under pressure. 7 aircraft remained in effective range. They did not approach immediately. Instead, they widened spacing to nearly 1,400 yards and climbed incrementally above the bomber's altitude. The maneuver was deliberate. They were creating vertical dominance. Donovan understood what that meant. A high-altitude descent would compress his reaction window faster than any prior approach. Gravity would increase closure speed. He would have less than 3 seconds between 800 and 400 yards. If he fired too early, ammunition would empty before convergence. If he waited too long, structural damage would precede correction. He did not rotate the turret immediately. He allowed the fighters to settle into what appeared to be staging posture. 1 aircraft dipped low, again presenting as bait. 2 others drifted laterally outward. The remaining 4 climbed slightly higher still. The geometry was forming a funnel. If he tracked the low element first, the high group would dive through his upper arc, forcing extreme elevation and reducing barrel control. If he aimed high prematurely, the low bait would close into 400-yard zone unopposed. The trap depended on urgency. Donovan refused urgency. He lowered the turret fractionally, intentionally appearing focused on the low element. He did not fire. He let the bait descend to approximately 900 yards, without engagement. From the perspective of the attacking pilots, it would appear that ammunition depletion or hesitation had set in. The high group reacted. 2 fighters initiated descent earlier than optimal, assuming reduced resistance. Their spacing narrowed unintentionally as they adjusted dive angle toward tail assembly. This was the first miscalculation the Luftwaffe had made since adapting. Donovan waited. The low bait crossed 750 yards. Still no fire. Inside the aircraft, silence thickened. Waist gunners expected engagement. The pilot did not intervene. The distance shortened. At approximately 700 yards, the 2 descending fighters aligned closer than intended, one slightly overtaking the other in dive path. The remaining 2 high aircraft delayed half-second, creating vertical stacking. Donovan elevated turret sharply, abandoning the bait entirely. He fired not at the lead, descending aircraft, but at the predicted intersection point of both dive paths. The burst was measured and sustained across that convergence window. The first fighter rolled violently mid-dive, trailing heavy smoke. The second attempted evasive bank but crossed into tracer stream before completing maneuver. Both aircraft broke formation simultaneously. The remaining 2 high fighters aborted descent instinctively, climbing to avoid collision path. The low bait, now inside 650 yards, accelerated unexpectedly. attempting to capitalize on his shift upward. Donovan had anticipated this. Without delay, he depressed the turret and delivered a short burst at low fighter's nose path rather than fuselage. The tracers intersected directly along its forward arc. The aircraft jerked upward, then rolled right and disengaged abruptly. The funnel collapsed. In less than 5 seconds, 3 attack vectors had been neutralized without sustained expenditure. The final 2 fighters, previously high reserve, attempted coordinated lateral cross. They split wide, intending to divide his fire. One committed slightly earlier than the other. Donovan did not pursue the first. He tracked the second, forcing it to adjust earlier than planned. The first, lacking synchronized crossfire, abandoned alignment rather than risk isolated exposure. The decision sequence had required restraint more than aggression. He had recognized that the trap relied on predictable defensive response. Engage the closest threat first. By withholding fire and allowing the bait to close, he had altered the timing of the high dive. The enemy's synchronization fractured under assumption. It was not marksmanship that disrupted the attack. It was sequence control. Ammunition counters now indicated dangerously low reserves, less than 1/3 remaining. Barrel heat approached caution threshold. The turret motors had endured repeated rapid adjustments. The remaining fighters withdrew beyond 1,500 yards. They circled loosely, no longer aligned in structured geometry. Their altitude advantage diminished, slightly as they reassessed. The airspace behind the bomber cleared momentarily. Inside the aircraft, no one spoke of what had just occurred. There was no time to assign meaning. The formation continued toward target. Other bombers in the group were now engaging separate fighter elements. Donovan exhaled slowly into his oxygen mask and checked feed mechanisms again. He had expended significant ammunition in controlled bursts, not continuous fire. The discipline had preserved options, but options were narrowing. The Luftwaffe had tested layered descent, bait, vertical stacking, lateral cross. All had failed. That did not mean they would withdraw, it meant they would commit differently. And if they returned one more time, it would not be exploratory, it would be decisive. The last 4 Bf-109s did not circle. They committed. No staging distance. No altitude advantage. They advanced in tight lateral line at approximately 900 yards, engines at full throttle. The formation was compressed, intentionally, accepting risk of overlap to reduce his targeting window. Ammunition counters showed less than a quarter remaining. There would be no second pass after this. Donovan steadied the turret and did not fire at first sight. He waited for the line to tighten further. The fighters held discipline, refusing early break. They were closing fast. At 700 yards, one aircraft edged slightly ahead of the others. The spacing narrowed to less than a wingspan between 2 elements. It was not perfect alignment, but it was enough. He fired. The burst was longer than any previous, but still controlled. He swept horizontally across the compressed line, not chasing a single silhouette. The lead aircraft took the first impact. Visible flash near wing root. The adjacent fighter flew directly through the residual tracer path. Both broke violently. One rolled downward, trailing smoke. The other climbed erratically and vanished above the tail arc. The remaining 2 attempted immediate split. Maneuver, one diving low, one climbing high. Donovan chose the low diver first. Short burst. Correction. Another burst. The aircraft shuddered mid-descent and disappeared beneath the bomber, trailing dark exhaust. It did not reappear. The final fighter held position longer than expected. It approached alone now, inside 600 yards. There was no formation left to protect it. Donovan fired the last measured burst he could afford. The tracers intersected just forward of the canopy. The fighter banked sharply and disengaged at steep angle, abandoning approach entirely. The rear sky cleared. He checked ammunition counters again, nearly empty. There would be no reserve for a second engagement. None came. The formation reached target. Bomb release proceeded without rear interference. On return leg, no further concentrated tail pursuit materialized. The turret motors cooled gradually. Frost thickened again along plexiglass edges. He logged ammunition expenditure precisely. He did not estimate victories. He recorded observed smoke trails, structural separation on one aircraft, multiple forced breaks, no claims. Back at Great Ashfield, maintenance crews examined the tail assembly. Minor scoring along stabilizer edge, no structural compromise, no control cables severed. Compared to other aircraft returning that day, damage was minimal. Intelligence debrief asked for sequence detail. Donovan described distances, angles, timing. He emphasized overlap moments. He did not refer to instinct. He referred to geometry. Later reports credited multiple confirmed enemy losses in that sector during the 4-minute window behind his aircraft. Attribution remained distributed across formation fire. His name did not appear prominently in summaries. But inside the squadron, something shifted. The nickname accountant was not repeated. On the next mission briefing, no one reminded the crew to hold fire strictly at 600 yards, and in the tail position at 23,000 feet over Germany, 12 Bf. 109 seconds had closed expecting compliance with doctrine. They found calculation instead. So here's the question. If you had been in that turret, with limited ammunition and 4 minutes to decide, would you have waited for orders? Or would you have fired first?